She screamed at the officers to arrest me for trespassing on my own family property. This blonde HOA president stood there smirking, thinking she'd won as police lights flashed across my grandfather's ranch. What this small-town tyrant didn't know was that back in Washington, D.C., my office wall displayed certificates from prosecuting over 200 corrupt HOA boards nationwide. My actual job? I'm the head of the federal department that can shut down any homeowner association in America with a single phone call. My name is David Mitchell, and after 12 grueling years fighting HOA corruption from behind a government desk, I desperately needed a break. My grandfather's cattle ranch in Montana had been calling to me for months, promising fresh air, mountain views, and maybe some decent trout fishing. What I discovered instead was a masterclass in small-town corruption that would make a Chicago politician blush. The woman currently directing police officers to handcuff me had apparently been planning this moment for 3 years, ever since my grandfather passed away. Over the next 5 days, she would learn exactly why crossing the head of national HOA enforcement was the biggest mistake of her pathetic life. Day 1 of what locals now call the Pinewood Valley. War began with my truck pulling into the familiar gravel driveway at sunset. After a 14-hour drive from D.C., I was running on pure exhaustion and gas station coffee. The moment my headlights swept across the log cabin my great-grandfather built in 1923, I felt 20 years of stress melt away. The towering pine trees, the creek babbling in the distance, the smell of mountain air. This was exactly what my soul needed after dealing with a particularly nasty HOA fraud case in Miami. All I wanted was to collapse on the old leather couch, crack open a beer, and sleep for approximately 16 hours. The universe, however, had different plans entirely. Blue and red lights shattered the peaceful evening before I could even grab my suitcase. 2 sheriff's deputies approached with the kind of aggressive posture usually reserved for armed suspects. Not exhausted federal employees coming home to their family property. "Sir, we've received reports of suspicious activity and possible breaking and entering," the younger deputy announced, his hand resting uncomfortably close to his weapon. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, having learned from years of law enforcement cooperation that compliance was always the smartest first move. "Officers, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. This is my family's ranch. I'm David Mitchell, and I can show you the property deed if you'll allow me to reach for my documents." That's when Karen Blackwood made her theatrical entrance, marching across the property line wearing what could only be described as her official HOA battle uniform. Even in the dim light, I could see the satisfaction gleaming in her eyes like a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly to my call. As I explained on the phone, this individual is clearly trespassing on property that falls under Pinewood Valley HOA jurisdiction. We have very strict policies about unauthorized access, and I've never seen this man before in my 4 years as president." She turned toward me with the kind of smile a snake might give before striking. "I'm sure you understand that we must protect our community from unknown individuals with questionable intentions." The older deputy, whose nameplate read Williams, shifted uncomfortably between us. "Ma'am, the gentleman claims this is his family property. Sir, do you have documentation proving ownership?" I slowly reached for my briefcase, retrieving the folder of legal documents I always kept current. Professional habit from years of untangling complex property disputes had taught me to document everything meticulously. "Deputy Williams, you'll see here that the Mitchell family has maintained continuous ownership of this land since 1923. My great-grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, homesteaded this property after returning from World War I. My grandfather inherited it, and it passed to me when he died 3 years ago." Williams examined the paperwork carefully, his expression shifting from suspicious to apologetic. "This documentation appears completely legitimate. Mr. Mitchell, I sincerely apologize for the confusion." He turned toward Karen, whose confident smile was rapidly transforming into something resembling a wax museum disaster. "Ma'am, this gentleman has every legal right to be on this property. According to these documents, this land isn't part of any HOA jurisdiction." But Karen wasn't finished. She stepped closer, and I caught an unpleasant mixture of cheap perfume and barely controlled rage. "Officer, I believe you should know that there have been some serious questions about the legitimacy of these supposed Mitchell property claims. Just last week, we discovered significant discrepancies in the boundary surveys. Perhaps this Mr. Mitchell doesn't realize he's actually standing on HOA common area that was illegally claimed by his family decades ago." Williams looked between us, clearly wanting to be anywhere else in Montana. "Ma'am, that would be a civil property dispute. Without a court order or clear evidence of criminal trespassing, we cannot take any enforcement action." He tipped his hat toward me respectfully. "Welcome home, Mr. Mitchell. Have a peaceful evening." As the patrol cars pulled away, leaving Karen and me alone in the sudden darkness, she moved closer with predatory intent. The friendly HOA president mask had completely slipped, revealing something much uglier underneath. "3 years ago, your grandfather destroyed everything my family worked for," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "We had plans for this entire valley. Big plans, resort development, luxury cabins, a golf course that would have brought millions in tourism revenue. But Thomas Mitchell had to play the stubborn old rancher, had to rally the county commissioners against progress." She stepped back, the fake smile returning like a bad actor's mask. "Now it's your turn to face reality, Mr. Mitchell. You have exactly 1 week to reconsider your presence here. After that, well, HOA regulations can be quite comprehensive when properly applied." As she walked away, her heels clicking against the gravel like a countdown timer, I finally understood the warning my grandfather had written in his last letter about the new people moving into the valley with big city attitudes and bigger city greed. This wasn't just about property disputes or HOA overreach. This was personal, generational, and about to become very, very expensive for someone. I pulled out my phone and made a quick voice memo. Day 1. Karen Blackwood just declared war on the wrong federal employee. She has absolutely no idea what she started. Because if there's one lesson I've learned from 12 years of prosecuting corrupt HOA officials, it's that power-drunk board presidents always make the same critical mistake. They assume their target is just another helpless homeowner who will fold under pressure. They never expect someone who knows their playbook better than they wrote it themselves. Day 2 began with what I can only describe as a violation blitzkrieg. At precisely 7 in the morning, I stumbled to the front door in my grandfather's old flannel robe, coffee mug in hand, only to discover my entire porch buried under a mountain of orange citation notices. 63 violations to be exact. I counted them twice, first in disbelief and then in professional fascination at the sheer audacity. Grass height exceeds community standards by 0.3 inches. Mailbox paint color. Violates approved residential palette. Unauthorized. Livestock odor detected on property. Visible. Coffee mug on porch violates. Outdoor beverage container restrictions. Fine. $250. The most absurd citation actually made me laugh out loud. Property owner observed wearing inappropriate sleepwear in public view of community members. Fine. $500. I gathered up the papers, noting that each bore Karen's ridiculously elaborate signature and had been time-stamped at various points throughout the night. This woman had apparently spent hours prowling around my property with measuring devices and a clipboard, documenting imaginary violations like some deranged compliance officer. But the final envelope was different. Handwritten on expensive personal stationery, it simply read David in Karen's sharp cursive. Inside, her message was as pointed as her personality. Mr. Mitchell, I trust you've received our Community Standards Orientation package. The Pinewood Valley HOA takes property compliance very seriously, especially for newcomers who may not understand our established protocols. Your grandfather may have operated under certain outdated exemptions, but those privileges expired with his death certificate. You now have 6 days remaining to consider our generous buyout offer. Don't force us to escalate this situation unnecessarily. K. Blackwood, HOA President. Under her signature, she'd added a postscript that made my blood pressure spike. P.S. Judge Morrison sends his personal regards and looks forward to meeting you in court. Judge Morrison. I knew that name from federal corruption files back in Washington. He'd been flagged in 2 separate HOA fraud investigations, but always managed to stay just clean enough to avoid indictment. If Karen had him in her pocket, this conspiracy ran deeper than simple neighborhood harassment. I was still processing this escalation when my neighbor appeared at the fence line, looking around nervously before waving me over. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Beth Anderson from the property next door. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I saw those violation notices and I had to warn you." She handed me a thick manila folder with trembling hands. "I've been documenting everything for 18 months. Karen isn't just vindictive, she's methodical. This folder contains copies of hundreds of violations she's issued to neighbors who crossed her. Photos of property damage that mysteriously occurred after people opposed her proposals, and financial records showing a clear pattern of targeting specific families. Inside were spreadsheets tracking a systematic campaign of harassment. She targets anyone who questions her authority, drives them out with legal fees and constant fines. The Hendersons lost their family cabin last summer over a supposedly illegal garden shed. They'd lived here for 40 years. Beth's voice dropped to a frightened whisper. "And it's not just the citations, David. Things happen to people who fight back. Pets disappear. Gardens die overnight from chemical damage. Vehicles get vandalized. But somehow there's never any evidence linking back to Karen or her supporters." I thanked Beth for her courage and spent the next 4 hours reviewing her meticulously documented evidence while fielding increasingly angry phone calls from my supervisor in Washington. Apparently, Karen had already filed formal complaints with my department, claiming I was abusing my federal position to intimidate a legitimate homeowner association. The irony was breathtaking. Here I was trying to take my first vacation in 3 years, and she'd essentially forced me to open an investigation into her operation. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw you talking to the Anderson woman this morning. Nosy neighbors tend to have unfortunate accidents around here. 5 days remaining." That afternoon, I decided to test Karen's boundaries by making highly visible improvements to my supposedly violation-heavy property. I grabbed professional surveying equipment from my truck and began precisely measuring my fence lines, making sure to position myself where the entire neighborhood could observe my activities. Within 20 minutes, pristine white golf cart came speeding down the dirt road like a suburban cavalry charge. Karen emerged wearing what could only be described as her combat uniform, pressed khakis, an official HOA logo polo shirt, and a visor that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. "Mr. Mitchell, I see you're attempting to address some of the compliance issues we identified. How refreshing. Though I should inform you that any property modifications require advance approval from our Architectural Review Committee. The next scheduled meeting isn't for another 8 weeks. I straightened up, channeling 12 years of dealing with petty bureaucrats and corrupt officials. "Actually, Karen, I was just confirming that all my property boundaries and structures are exactly within legal specifications." Interesting thing about professional surveying equipment, it tends to provide much more accurate measurements than whatever tools you used. For your midnight documentation expedition, her smile tightened like a stretched rubber band about to snap. "Are you suggesting that our violation assessments were somehow inaccurate, Mr. Mitchell?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating definitively that your citations are fraudulent and your measurements are fabricated. I'm also curious how you managed to assess my grass height at 2:30 in the morning, according to your timestamp. Must have been challenging to get accurate readings in complete darkness." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you're clever, don't you? Just like your stubborn grandfather. He thought he was smart too, right up until his final heart attack. Stress can be so devastating for men your age, especially when they're fighting battles they can't possibly win." Something in her tone made every instinct scream danger. "What exactly are you implying about my grandfather's death, Karen?" Her laugh was sharp and bitter as broken glass. "Oh, you don't know the whole story? Your precious grandfather died of cardiac arrest just 2 days after our last heated confrontation about the development project. The stress of fighting inevitable progress, I suppose. Weak hearts seem to run in your family bloodline. David, you should be extremely careful about your health. The casual cruelty hit me like a physical blow. But I forced myself to remain outwardly calm, even as rage built in my chest like a pressure cooker. Karen, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to step back from this path. Cancel these fabricated violations, stop the harassment campaign, and we can coexist peacefully as neighbors. Otherwise, I'll be forced to use every resource at my disposal to expose what you're really doing here. She laughed again, already heading back toward her golf cart. And what resources would those be exactly? Your government friends in Washington? Judge Morrison is eagerly anticipating your lawsuit, David. He does so enjoy teaching outsiders about real Montana justice. As she drove away, I realized three critical things. First, this conspiracy extended far beyond simple HOA corruption. Second, Karen Blackwood had just made a fatal tactical error by revealing her connection to Judge Morrison and making veiled threats about my grandfather's death. And third, she had absolutely no idea who she was really dealing with. I pulled out my secure phone and started making calls to Washington. If Karen wanted to escalate this to federal warfare, I'd show her exactly why they called me the HOA Terminator back at headquarters. The remaining 5 days of her ultimatum were about to become the longest of her miserable life. 3 arrived with the kind of Montana sunrise that makes you understand why people write songs about big sky country. I should have been enjoying it from my porch with fresh coffee and peaceful silence. Instead, I was staring at the chemically destroyed remains of my grandfather's prize-winning vegetable garden while a county sheriff's deputy took photographs. For evidence documentation, the plants hadn't simply died, they'd been systematically murdered with industrial-grade herbicide, the soil around them black and reeking of chemical warfare. But it was the surgical precision of the destruction that confirmed my worst suspicions. Only the heritage tomatoes and century-old apple trees were dead. The newer landscaping I'd planted last summer remained completely untouched. This wasn't random vandalism. This was targeted psychological terrorism designed to cause maximum emotional damage. Mr. Mitchell, I understand your frustration, but without direct evidence linking this to a specific individual, I can only file this as vandalism by unknown perpetrators, Deputy Collins explained, clearly uncomfortable with the obvious implications. You might want to contact your insurance company about the damage. I nodded calmly, not trusting myself to speak yet, while fury burned in my chest like acid. What Karen didn't know was that I'd installed military-grade security cameras 18 hours earlier, complete with night vision capabilities and direct cloud uploading. Professional paranoia from years of investigating death threats against federal prosecutors had taught me to document everything. Back inside the cabin, I pulled up the crystal-clear footage on my laptop, hands trembling slightly with suppressed rage. There it was, recorded in perfect high-definition detail. Robert Blackwood, Karen's husband, sneaking across my property at 3:27 in the morning with a commercial spray tank. But the audio recording was what sealed their fate completely. Karen's voice tinny but clear through his phone speaker. Remember, only the old plants that have sentimental value. And Robert, make sure you're wearing those shoes I bought. They're 3 sizes larger than your actual feet to confuse any footprint analysis. The calculated malice of it, the premeditated psychological cruelty, made my stomach turn with disgust. This wasn't just neighbor harassment anymore. This was organized criminal conspiracy designed to cause maximum emotional trauma. I made multiple copies of everything, then sat in my grandfather's old leather recliner to plan my counterattack. The familiar smell of pipe tobacco and wood polish helped center my thoughts as I considered my available options. I could present this evidence to local law enforcement, but Deputy Collins had already demonstrated how that approach would fail. The local justice system was clearly compromised or intimidated by Karen's influence network. I could file a federal civil rights lawsuit, but that would take months to develop and play directly into their delay tactics. Or I could deploy what I did best, use their own corrupt system against them with surgical precision. My secure phone rang, interrupting my strategic planning. It was Maria Santos, the FBI liaison I'd worked with on dozens of HOA corruption cases over the years. David, I got your message about potential RICO violations in Montana. Please tell me you're not investigating criminal conspiracies during your first vacation in 3 years. Her voice carried the familiar mix of concern and exasperation that came from watching me tilt at windmills for over a decade. Maria, they poisoned my grandfather's memorial garden and threatened my life. This stopped being a vacation the moment they declared war on my family. I could hear her sigh through the encrypted connection. All right, send me everything you've documented so far. But David, be extremely careful. Rural corruption networks can be much more dangerous than urban cases, because everyone knows everyone else. And outsiders have no natural allies or protection. I spent the next 2 hours securely uploading evidence files to Maria, while trying to ignore the gaping wound in the garden visible through my kitchen window. That's when Margaret Chen appeared at my back gate, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing an expression of determined neighborly solidarity. "Mr. Mitchell, I brought you some dinner. Figured you might not feel like cooking after what happened to your beautiful garden." Margaret had lived in the valley for 25 years, predating Karen's reign of terror by over a decade. "Your grandfather and I used to trade vegetables every summer," she said, settling into the kitchen chair like she belonged there. "He gave me starts from those heritage tomatoes his father brought from Virginia. They're thriving in my greenhouse if you'd like some replacement plants." The simple kindness nearly broke through my emotional armor entirely. "Thank you, Margaret. That means more than you could possibly know." She patted my hand with her weathered one, calloused from decades of ranch work. "That's what real neighbors do for each other, son. Not like that Blackwood woman and her collection of flying monkeys from the city." I leaned forward intently. "Tell me everything you know about Judge Morrison's relationship with Karen." Margaret's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "Randall Morrison owns approximately 60% of the commercial real estate development rights in this county through various shell companies and limited partnerships. He and Karen have had a profitable arrangement for the past 4 years. She systematically harasses longtime residents with fabricated violations and crushing legal fees until they're forced to sell at below-market prices. His development companies then purchase the distressed properties for pennies on the dollar and flip them to out-of-state buyers for luxury vacation homes or resort development. The criminal conspiracy was becoming crystal clear, far worse than I'd initially suspected. Your family's ranch represents the crown jewel they've been pursuing. 800 acres of prime mountain valley land with natural springs, highway access, and development potential worth tens of millions to the right investors," Margaret continued. "They've been systematically acquiring surrounding properties for 3 years, and your ranch is the final piece they need to launch their resort project. Margaret, would you be willing to provide sworn testimony about this conspiracy to federal investigators?" She smiled grimly, steel showing beneath her grandmotherly exterior. "At 73 years old, what can they threaten me with that age won't accomplish anyway? Yes, I'll testify, but you'll need much more than one old rancher's word against Judge Morrison's political machine." After Margaret left with promises to gather more evidence from other longtime residents, I returned to analyzing my security footage more systematically. Going back through several weeks of recordings, what I discovered made my blood run cold, with a combination of rage and professional fascination. Over the past month, there had been dozens of instances of systematic trespassing and surveillance. Robert Blackwood measuring my property boundaries at midnight with professional surveying equipment. Karen herself photographing every structure and potential violation from multiple angles, like a military intelligence operative. And most disturbing, 3 separate occasions where an unidentified man in expensive business attire had examined my fence lines while taking detailed notes and making phone calls, but it was a conversation captured 5 nights earlier that transformed everything, from personal harassment into federal criminal conspiracy. Karen's voice carried on the mountain wind to my sensitive recording equipment. "Yes, Judge Morrison, the psychological pressure campaign is proceeding exactly as planned. He'll break down just like his stubborn grandfather did. Weak hearts and high blood pressure run in that family's genetic history." Judge Morrison's response was muffled by distance but clear enough to understand. "Excellent work, Karen. The development investors are becoming impatient with delays. If he doesn't accept our buyout offer within your timeline, we'll proceed with the judicial condemnation option." I've already prepared the emergency health and safety violation paperwork for immediate property seizure. Karen's laughter was like ice cracking. Septic system failures and structural safety violations are so convenient for justifying emergency condemnation proceedings. Just make sure your husband doesn't leave any physical evidence of the garden destruction. We can't afford another investigation like what happened with the Henderson family, where too many questions got asked by nosy reporters. I saved the audio file in multiple secure locations, my prosecutor's mind racing through the legal implications. They had just confessed on tape to conspiracy, extortion, judicial corruption, and potentially accessory to murder if their comments about my grandfather's death were what I suspected. But I needed them to incriminate themselves beyond any reasonable doubt. On record, with witnesses present, as if summoned by my thoughts, my phone buzzed with another anonymous text. 3 days remaining, David. Your grandfather's grave looks so peaceful in the cemetery. He certainly found his final rest after all that cardiac stress. Hope your heart is stronger than his was. The cruel implication made my decision final and irrevocable. I opened my laptop and began composing an encrypted email to FBI. Director Harrison in Washington. Director, I need you to quietly authorize a full federal investigation into Judge Randall Morrison and the Pinewood Valley HOA criminal conspiracy. Also, please contact our friends in the Justice Department's Public Corruption Unit. It appears my vacation just became an undercover operation that could expose organized corruption throughout the Montana judicial system. Because if Karen Blackwood wanted to play federal hardball, she was about to discover why I'd earned the nickname the HOA Executioner among defense attorneys across the country. The final 3 days of her ultimatum would determine who ended up in that cemetery plot she'd so thoughtfully referenced. And I was absolutely certain it wouldn't be me. If you enjoyed this story of HOA justice and want to hear more tales of corrupt boards getting their comeuppance, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what HOA nightmare you'd like me to tackle next. Remember, sometimes the best revenge against petty tyrants is simply knowing the rules better than they do. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight against neighborhood tyranny.